Hello and welcome to Washington College and to this evening's talk, which is entitled Jay Gatsby's Romantic Hero or Substitute. And I think, as you may suspect from the very beginning, that it is a kind of trick question, and that presumably the obvious answer, the correct answer is romantic hero. The answer that I prefer and that I'll encourage you in the course of what I think will be a brief presentation to encourage you to think of substitute as the more objectively true, more realistically or objectively based designation of Gatsby. In any event, it's quite clear that romantic or the word romantic or the idea of Gatsby as a romantic figure, uh, certainly an image that he fashions himself and which is augmented throughout the novel by Nick Carraway's glorification of him as a romantic hero, would suggest his qualifying for that designation. At the same time, well, let me just jump right away to the point that I want to make. The word substitute, I think it may occur only once. I didn't double check on doing a word search on my Kindle app, but it does appear very early on like the second or third page of the novel, in which, if you go back and look at it, it's page 2, page 3. Nick Carraway says, "There's a tradition in my family, very romantic tradition that parallels Gatsby's, a very romantic tradition that in my family that we're descended from a ducal family. It's the Duke of Bakla or some, I've never known how to pronounce it. Um, but in fact, what he says, and I'm quoting this, the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1851 then presumably, and at the time of the Civil War, and sent a substitute to the Civil War." The point that I'm going to make, and I'll jump to my conclusion in a way, um, is that the word substitute is kind of buried, it's almost hidden there. We can think of it as a kind of purloined word on the model of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter, so that it's a word which is there, it's right out there in the open, yet no one notices its significance. I don't think that, I could be wrong, I haven't read all of the major criticism of the Great Gatsby, but I'd be very surprised if, and I should do a search on the MLA bibliography perhaps online to see whether or not someone else has had the idea of offering substitute as a substitute, as it were, for the phrase romantic hero as a way of designating Gatsby. Anyway, the main point that I want to make is that Nick, throughout the novel, and Gatsby himself as well, the two of them, they're collaborating, and trying to corroborate each other's image, presentation of Gatsby as a romantic figure, but that it doesn't really survive scrutiny. The only evidence, as it were, for the claim is the claim itself. This is what Gatsby says about him, and Nick repeats, or Nick embellishes even on, and embellishes at great length at times, on the image that Gatsby would, in which Gatsby would have us believe. Nick says that Gatsby had an extraordinary gift of hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person. Well, whether we find that romantic readiness, that gift of hope, and so on, in Gatsby is questionable at the very least. Remember, Tom Buchanan in the Hotel Plaza scene says, "You're Mr. Nobody from nowhere," and who's going to gainsay him? That his description of Gatsby is every bit as legitimate, every bit as well-founded, and perhaps even more so than what Gatsby and Nick say about themselves. And it's very clear that Gatsby indulges in this self-fashioning, self-fabrication, as it were. Remember in the scene where he's talking with Nick, where they're first getting acquainted with each other, and he tells Nick that he was educated at Oxford University. Why was he educated at Oxford? Well, it was a family tradition, kind of interestingly, somewhat like in parallel with the quote-unquote family tradition that Nick Carraway mentions at the very beginning. Where did he get all his money from? He inherited it. That when all the other members of his family died, all the other members of his family died, I came into a good deal, not a lot, a good deal of money. Remember his heroism during the First World War. Every Allied government, not only a handful of them, every Allied government gave Gatsby a decoration. Even little Montenegro, you might remember, he shows Nick the medal. And he says, oh yeah, so I guess it must be true. At the same time, you might also remember in that scene between Gatsby and Nick, that Nick says that Gatsby looked sideways at him, and I understood why Jordan Baker had believed that he was lying, that he's capable of lying and perhaps lies about himself in a very self-aggrandizing way. So Nick allows us to question every now and question, particularly at that point, whether Gatsby is telling the truth. But he never allows us to question his romantic portrayal of Gatsby. In other words, he never says, well, maybe he had this romantic readiness, but maybe it was something else. He talks about the meretricious quality, or those meretricious people. I'm forgetting for the moment what noun he applies the adjective meretricious, as though it's only on the surface that they have an appealing appearance or presentation, but he never applies it to Gatsby. Interestingly, what I find among many things fascinating about the novel, and it makes it really, really interesting to read, to think about, and also to teach, which I've been doing for any number of years, is to notice the way in which inadvertently, and without meaning to, Nick reveals, as it were, not what he would like to think of as the spontaneous, and this way in which he idealizes Gatsby's love for Daisy. There's that scene where he talks about, Gatsby had told him, he recounts to us then what Gatsby told him about first meeting Daisy 5 years previously in Louisville and at Camp Taylor, where he was in an army camp then. He was an officer along with the other officers. And what we learn is that it's not so much Daisy, a particular woman with whom Gatsby is in love, but rather that he's drawn very, very powerfully indeed to the one woman whom everyone else, every other guy, every other officer at Camp Taylor is pursuing her as well. So he says, I'm quoting, this is Nick, and Nick repeating for us then what Gatsby had told him. She was by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. And then he refers to the excited young officers from Camp Taylor. She was desired by all of them. So Gatsby's desire for her is very much what René Girard, the literary critic, some of you may be familiar with his work, calls mimetic desire. In other words, quite simply, Gatsby falls in love with Daisy because every other guy is in love with her, and he's mimicking, as it were, the desire of other young men. The other point is to notice, and this is my own view, and you can agree or disagree with it, but there are those many speeches where, many places in the novel where Nick is telling us various things that Gatsby told him, and one of them, it's at the end of whichever chapter it is. He's walking along I think it's chapter 7. He's walking along in the evening with Daisy along the street in Louisville, and the street turns into a ladder, and he can climb up above the trees, and so on. It goes on, and you realize that that is not Gatsby speaking. There is no scene in the novel, and there could very easily have been a scene in which Nick overhears a conversation between Gatsby and Daisy, and in which Gatsby is speaking in this very, very eloquent way with these beautifully flowing sentences and so on. He never does. He never does. He'll say things, oh yeah, look, it's raining outside, or something along those lines. Very simple, very, very monosyllabic words that Gatsby uses. In the only conversation that we ever have, his vocabulary and his syntax are very, very rudimentary indeed. Which is not, I don't mean that as a criticism of him so much, but just to realize that Nick is making it up when he gives all of these grandiloquent words to Gatsby. Okay, as far as so rushing aside with one sweep of the hand, as it were, clearing the deck of the attribution of the designation of Gatsby as a romantic hero, and moving on then to the idea and what I said from the very beginning, while the whole business of his being a romantic figure, very subjective. It's what he would like to think about himself. It's what Nick wants to think about him and wants us to think about him as well. As far as the idea of Gatsby being much more objectively and not obviously, because it's something that is easy to overlook, but much more validly, let's say, to think of him as a substitute, is you realize right away, well, is Gatsby a substitute for anyone? Well, yeah, how about Daisy Buchanan? Daisy, who runs over Myrtle Wilson, who kills her, but Gatsby, who is killed by George Wilson, by Myrtle's husband, as the murderer on the mistaken notion. He got the wrong man, as it were. That he goes not as a substitute to the Civil War, but a substitute to the war that's going on between Tom Buchanan and Gatsby. In effect, that the curious thing, the irony, is that in the novel, Gatsby wants to be, if he wants to be a substitute, yes, he does want to be a substitute. He wants to be a substitute for Tom Buchanan. He wants to take Tom Buchanan's place. And the irony then, and it's an aspect of the novel that I think I'm correct in saying is overlooked. The great irony is that in wanting to be the substitute of Tom Buchanan, he ends up being the substitute, rather, of Tom's wife, of Daisy, of the woman that he wanted. I'm not going to go into details here because I want to keep this short, but just think for yourselves, thinking back to your reading of the novel or the next time you read it, just notice the lengths that Fitzgerald goes to create a plot in which Gatsby ends up being blamed in the mind of George Wilson, being blamed for the death of George's wife Myrtle, and leading then to the consequence of Gatsby being killed in place of Daisy. The other thing, and I'm going to, this will be the final point. So, say on the one hand, it's so obvious. If I say to you, he dies in place, he's a substitute, a surrogate for Daisy, you're going to say, well, yeah, that's true. Something I never noticed. Let me make the further point that it's something that you may not think about, but that the effect of the novel depends tremendously on that detail, on Gatsby dying in place of Daisy. That in other words, if at the end of the novel he had just, it ended with the Plaza Hotel scene where Gatsby is so devastated, it's not the great American novel, not by a long shot. Fitzgerald really, really needs to have Gatsby killed in the way in which he is. Okay, the second point with respect to this purloined word, substitute, which is there at the very beginning of the novel, and then at the end of the novel, Gatsby dies as a substitute. First of all, very obviously, in place of Daisy. Second, he dies as a substitute or he goes to his end, then he dies, as a substitute for Nick Carraway. He's the go-between, as it were, for Nick Carraway. It's very, very curious. In this novel, it looks as though, if you're reading it superficially, I won't go more into that, but you're reading the novel, and if you were given, say, a reading quiz, if you're a student, and you're given a reading quiz in which the teacher asks you to talk about someone, is there a go-between in the novel? And you would say, well, yeah, Nick Carraway is Gatsby's go-between. That Gatsby needs Nick to arrange to have Daisy come over and have tea at his house and so on. He has to have he can't go directly and so on. In any number of ways, Nick is the one who does what Gatsby wants him to do. But if you read the novel more closely, and I'll point out a couple of passages to you, you'll see the situation is actually reversed, and that Gatsby is Nick's go-between. In this edition, then, I don't know what the year of the publication is, I hadn't noticed, of this particular edition, but it's on page 25 in the first chapter, then, that Nick says that what he wants, now it's supposed to, what the novel is supposed to, our attention is supposed to be focused on what Gatsby wants, but what Nick wants, and he says it very, very clearly, is he wants Daisy to leave Tom. He wants her to rush out of the house with the child in his arms. Whether Gatsby wants the child, that's another question, but putting it aside, he wants her to rush out of the house, but at the same time, he thinks there is no such intention in her mind. It's very interesting. Well, how can we get her motivated? Well, how about let's have Gatsby come along, and Gatsby will give her the motivation. Of course, it doesn't work out, but at least he can go. Nick can't, because remember, what is it, third cousin, twice removed, or whatever, which I always think, as a Catholic myself, I think of as the most Catholic aspect, and under-noticed, least remarked aspect of the novel, that it's written by a Catholic, and that Fitzgerald puts in that detail as an impediment to marriage. You can't marry a cousin within a certain range. So anyway, he can't do it because of the blood relationship that he has with Daisy. So Gatsby comes along, and what's interesting is so remember, Jordan Baker talks to Nick and says Gatsby would like you to help him to arrange the reunion between himself and Daisy. So Nick is talking the next day, I guess it is, he's talking with Gatsby, and he says, I hear you'd like me to do you a favor, get Daisy to come over. Gatsby says, well, I don't want to really trouble you. And Nick says, no trouble at all. He says, how about tomorrow? Or the day after tomorrow, whatever it is. It's Nick who's really insisting and who's pushing Gatsby to get out there, to go to the war, as it were, and eventually to get himself killed. When Gatsby comes over to the house, he's waiting for Daisy, and he says she's late, and he says, I don't think she's going to come. He stands up, and Nick says he sat down again as though I had pushed him. And Nick said he doesn't push him, but he does say, you're being silly and so on. No, be a little more patient. And then a little bit later, after Daisy has arrived, Gatsby says, "Oh, I think this is really a bad idea." And Nick says to him, "Oh, you're being such a little boy. Will you please stop?" He's just so insistent. He does not want Gatsby to leave. He wants Gatsby to go ahead and to do whatever he can in the hope then of, again, it's supposed to be the reunion. It's supposed to be Gatsby wanting that reunion, but it's Nick wanting Daisy out of the house as an act of revenge against Tom Buchanan. He's very envious of Tom Buchanan, as you may have noticed, and his envy is partly expressed through the fact he never misses an opportunity to denigrate Tom Buchanan. And if he's doing that, you can suspect that there is a purloined motive, as it were. Okay, I'm going to finish up by saying that H.L. Mencken, the American journalist, writer, so on, a very famous figure at the time, he reads I don't know if it was the manuscript or if Fitzgerald sent him a copy of the novel, but he says it's nothing more than a glorified anecdote, which is a big put down for sure. Fitzgerald says, yeah, I think he's right. There's no emotional backbone. There's no emotional backbone to the novel. And the point that I'll conclude with then is he's right. I mean, it's a very, very feeble backbone, very wishy-washy, as it were, backbone. If you think of this as a romantic novel, I mean, it's pretty kind of silly. It's adolescent. If, on the other hand, you notice this purloined word, this hidden aspect, you learn not only a truth about Gatsby, but also you see the presence and the kind of surreptitious, the covert presence of a motive. I was teaching over at Bucharest a year or so ago, and there was a student said, "Well, I think the clue is, or I think the secret in this novel is that Nick Carraway is gay." And I thought, oh my God, is that? I mean, that's been around for a long time, and there are other secrets of that sort, of a psychological nature that you'll hear. But I think it's so much more interesting to realize the secret is that relation between Nick Carraway and Gatsby. It's not that it's a homosexual relationship or what, but that the relation of the go-between and the person whom the go-between is serving is the mirror opposite. It's the inversion. There's an inversion for you, an inversion of what you might otherwise think. Okay, with that, I'm going to finish. I hope it's been. I find it interesting, and I hope that you will as well. Okay, bye-bye.